Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and our event, the Northern Triangle of Central America, Violence, Security, and Migration. My name is Eric Olson. I'm the Associate Director of the Latin American Program, and it's a delight to see so many people here in this room today. We had an unbelievable response. I believe we have folks down on the 5th floor in the overflow room, so if you don't behave, you may end up in the 5th floor. But by and large, I think we should do fine. And of course, we're being joined by tens of thousands of people on the worldwide net. So thank you all for being with us. It's a great start to a new year. Before I get started on the program, I just wanted to recognize a couple of special people here with us today. We'll do introductions of panelists later, but for now, a special welcome to our keynote speaker, Acting Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, Ambassador Mari Carmen Aponte. Bienvenida, Embajadora. You are a shining star in U.S. Diplomacy, so thank you for being with us today and appreciate that very much. I also want to recognize representatives from the Northern Triangle countries. We are talking about the Northern Triangle countries, and so it's a delight to have with us the Ambassador of El Salvador, Claudia Canjura de Centeno. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. The Ambassador of Guatemala, Marta Ruiz de Vilman. I note that the Northern Triangle is now represented by two dynamic women ambassadors, and we can only hope Honduras follows suit very soon. So thank you all for being here. Other folks that I want to recognize, of course, are Gwen Young, the director of our Global Women's Leadership Initiative at the Wilson Center, and the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, represented today by Joan Timoney and Alexandria Arriaga, who will be on our panel in just a moment. I see Ambassador Campbell from Nicaragua has just entered as well. Thank you, Ambassador Campbell, for coming. And then I also wanted to recognize somebody else from the Women in International Security program, Dr. Chantal de Jorge Udrat, who's the president of WISE. So thank you for your role in supporting of this event and with the U.S. Civil Society Working Group. I also want to thank our Latin America program colleagues who have helped arrange for this event. Cynthia Arnson, the director, Jacqueline Dozal, who's organized the event, and many interns, some of which are new this week, and I don't even know their names. So thank you all for volunteering and participating in our event, and our friends in the AV department as well. This is the inaugural event of a series of activities that the Latin America program will undertake over the next 2 years that will focus on security and governance in Central America, especially on the factors that contribute to violence and elevated migration from the Northern Triangle countries. For too long, the U.S. has viewed Central America through the narrow lens of the Cold War, or more recently, through the optics of the war on drugs. While illicit drugs and ideological conflict are part of the explanation of the instability and insecurity in Central America, they are not a full explanation. Our goal over the next 2 years is to push back against conventional wisdom about the causes of violence in the region, to examine the complex factors contributing to the current insecurity. In the process, we want to identify and discuss more appropriate policy approaches to the challenges of public insecurity, corruption, and weakened state institution. What role can and should the international community play in addressing these issues? We will focus on community-level violence, youth violence, gender-based violence, violence generated by the state, and the violence of criminal organizations engaged in smuggling and trafficking of persons and illicit products. We will search for new and innovative approaches to responding to these challenges and threats. Our specific topic today is the nexus between violence, women, and migration in the Northern Triangle. How is violence against women at the household level, as well as at the broader societal level, contributing to insecurity and migration from the region. What role can and should women play in addressing these challenges and concerns? Let me take just a moment to introduce my colleague, Gwen Young, who will then introduce our keynote speaker. Gwen Young is the director of the Wilson Center's Global Women's Leadership Initiative and the Women in Public Service Project. She has over 20 years of experience in international public service. She has advocated for and published on the role of girls and women, the role that girls and women play in political, social, and economic development. She has worked as a professional advocate for women and human rights in corporate law settings and with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice at the University of San Diego. Her full bio is in the back, but it's a delight. It's been a delight to work with your program here at the Wilson Center on this topic and this event. Thank you very much, and please.
Thank you, Eric, and welcome all. It's a pleasure to have a topic close to my heart to talk about today and to introduce such an amazing panel of speakers and women in public service. Our focus is on ensuring that by 2050, 50% of all government leadership positions are held by women. So we have some of you in the audience today, and I'm about to introduce a leader in that, so it is my distinct pleasure and distinct honor to introduce the Acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of the Western Hemisphere, Marie-Carmen Aponte, who was appointed Acting Assistant Secretary in the Department of State's Bureau of the Western Hemisphere Affairs on May 5th, 2016. Previously, Aponte was the Ambassador of the United States to El Salvador from 2012 until February 2016. And her priorities in El Salvador included expanding crime prevention, growing the economy and moving the country towards democracy, sustainable development, and human rights. She is the first Puerto Rican woman to hold the title of ambassador. Born in Puerto Rico, Aponte moved to the United States to pursue a better education. And after earning her BA in political science from Rosemont College, she taught in Camden, New Jersey, and became aware of underrepresented educational needs of minority students, which, as you will see in her bio, continues as a theme and a thread. She enrolled in Temple University Beasley School of Law and earned a JD in 1975. And she was one of the few Puerto Rican women enrolled in a U.S. accredited law program at that time and the first Latina lawyer in Pennsylvania. She moved to Washington, D.C., which she now calls home, in 1979, when President Jimmy Carter appointed her as a White House Fellow. She continued practicing law in D.C. and co-founded one of the first minority-owned law firms. In 1984, Aponte was elected the first woman president of the Hispanic National Bar Association. She continued to hold leadership positions for the next 25 years, advocating for women in the Latino community. From 2001 to 2004, she was executive director of the Puerto Rican Federal Affairs Administration. She was also on the board of the directors for the National Council of La Raza and the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund, and later provided strategic counsel for the Hispanic Information and Telecommunications Network, which is a Spanish-speaking national non-commercial television network. Aponte received the 2015 Margaret Brent Women Lawyers Achievement Award from the American Bar Association in recognition of her community service. And we are honored to have you today, Ambassador. Welcome.
Muy buenas tardes. This is one of my last public appearances, and I have to say that seeing so many women in the audience gives me such energy. I'm grateful that you are here, and I also was making a memory of my first days in Washington, D.C., which was before some of you were born, when President Jimmy Carter was in office, and I heard him talk about the role of women. And he was referring to, at the time, Secretary Patricia Roberts Harris, who was the Secretary of Health and Human Services at the time. And basically the way he spoke about her and referred to women was very simply, as he put it, if you want a complicated problem solved efficiently and with a lot of heart, give the problem to a woman. I have never forgotten that. And I hope that as we move on, we always remember that it is the women who get it done. So I want to thank Gwen, and I want to thank Eric, and I want to thank the Wilson Center for giving me this opportunity and inviting me to join you as you discuss violence, security, migration, and women in the Northern Triangle. Over the course of my tenure as U.S. Ambassador to El Salvador and Acting Assistant Secretary in the State Department's Bureau of Western Hemisphere, I have had the tremendous privilege of witnessing firsthand the remarkable changes that are going on in this region. The countries of the Americas have made significant progress toward consolidating democratic rule, combating corruption, and encouraging greater government responsiveness and accountability. I've seen the violence that drives migration from Central America, as well as the profound determination to improve the situation. The United States and our partners in the Northern Triangle understand that progress depends on creating opportunity and strengthening the rule of law for all, including and especially women and girls. These solutions require addressing underlying causes of crime and inequality, such as poverty, unemployment, poor health care, including limited reproductive health care, lack of access to education, and weak institutions that foster corruption and impunity. We know that when everyone is afforded the same treatment under the law, and when our societies practice good governance and transparency, we thrive together. Effective efforts to combat crime and strengthen the rule of law must include steps to protect those who are disproportionately affected by conflict and by violence. They must be equal partners in and beneficiaries of the pursuit of peace and security. Citizens from Central America are leading the charge to establish a more gender-inclusive approach to security and judicial issues. Legal professionals and civil society are playing an important role in strengthening the rule of law and combating violence against women and girls in the Northern Triangle. We acknowledge and salute leaders like Telma Aldaña, last year's winner of International Women of Courage Award, and Claudia Paz y Paz, who is here with us today, and who have brought accountability to perpetrators of human rights in Guatemala. We also recognize the work of human rights activists, many of whom face frequent threats or are even killed for the work, including Berta Cáceres, an environmental and indigenous rights activist from Honduras who was murdered last March. She was a strong model for women, and shortly before her murder, was awarded one of the United Nations top prizes for her advocacy in support of sustainable development. The United Nations Development Program reports that violence against women is a principal contributor to citizen insecurity in broad terms. In the Northern Triangle specifically, gender-based violence is a core concern, as homicide and femicide rates are among the highest in the world. Many women are victims of violence in their homes. All too often, we see women bear a heavy burden in confronting the effects of crime and violence on their families and communities. Women from historically marginalized groups, including indigenous, lesbian, transgender, and women of African descent, are especially vulnerable to discrimination and violence. Young women and girls often experience sexual assault or abuse by gang members, forcing them to drop out of school or to relocate. Some are caught in the crossfire during disputes with gangs, with girlfriends, sisters, and mothers targeted by rival gangs. The violence perpetrated by organized criminal organizations contributes to the emigration of women from Central America to the United States. While making the perilous journey north, migrant women and girls are far more likely to be trafficked, physically attacked, or sexually assaulted along the migration route than men. Women in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras need and deserve their governments to uphold the rule of law, including by guaranteeing better protection and access to justice. Experience shows that when women participate more fully in society, countries are safer and more prosperous for all citizens. This reality has driven US policy, and we are taking concrete steps to empower women as equal participants in peace and security spheres. As President Obama has said, one of the best indicators of whether a country will succeed is how it treats its women. In 2011, the United States released its first ever National Action Plan for Women, Peace, and Security. It aims to ensure that women's voices are heard, not marginalized, that women's views are included, not sidelined, that women's needs and interests are served, not ignored, and that women's ideas and inspirations for lasting peace and justice are at the heart of US diplomatic efforts around the world. With a view toward long-term implementation of this commitment, the United States updated the plan in 2016 to ensure it continues to respond to the challenges of a changing world. In addition to equal protection under the law, it is vital for the justice system to recruit, train, and retain female police officers, prosecutors, and judges who can work with their male counterparts to reduce the barriers to justice faced by women. To end violence against women, we must continue to move with urgency to achieve parity between women and men in all aspects of public life. We have to hold up the principles of equality and women's empowerment to build an environment where it's never okay to look away or to stay silent when women are attacked or abused. Our aim is to work with the Northern Triangle governments to make a clear path to justice when women are subjected to violence. Sadly, that path is often obstructed by the broader barriers women face in our societies. Barriers like unequal access to quality education and stable employment, gender stereotypes and outright discrimination, and of course a patriarchal system of laws and statutes that do not reflect the experiences and reality of women and girls. The migration flow from the Northern Triangle to the United States is just one result of the serious challenges facing the region. In fiscal year 2014, the US Department of Homeland Security apprehended a total of 51,705 unaccompanied migrant children from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras along the US southwest border, a 145% increase over the fiscal year 2013 total. In early 2015, the US government launched the US Strategy for Engagement in Central America, a multi-year initiative to promote a secure and prosperous Central America that ensures a safe environment for its citizens, enhances economic opportunities, and enjoys more accountable, transparent, and effective public institutions. The US Congress allocated $750 million in fiscal year 2016 funding to advance the US Strategy for Engagement in Central America. The Congress is now considering a similar request for the year 2017. The strategy complements reforms efforts already in progress by the Northern Triangle governments. Through their plan of the Alliance for Prosperity, the Northern Triangle countries committed a $2.6 billion of their own funds in 2016, and we expect a similar level of support in 2017. We are addressing women, peace, and security issues in the region as part of an integrated rollout strategy that includes a multitude of projects and across-the-board attention to gender equity. In Guatemala, we're supporting the 24-hour court system, an effective means of reducing pretrial detention, protecting victims, and increasing the efficiency of the judicial system. One of the courts specializes in services related to violence directed toward women, including sexual assault, exploitation, and trafficking of women and children. Victims can report crimes 24 hours a day and receive follow-up medical and social services. In El Salvador, we're working with the government to strengthen the rule of law and protection of the human rights of women and girls through a variety of initiatives. Some of these initiatives include inauguration of 24 new centers to assist survivors of domestic and sexual violence and increased training in victim services and community outreach. In Honduras, we are supporting an integrated response mechanism for victims of gender-based violence in target communities in San Pedro Sula and providing technical assistance to the Women's City Ciudad Mujer project. These are one-stop service centers for women, primarily victims of gender-based violence and/or returned migrants. We also work with regional partners to support capacity building in law enforcement institutions in order to raise awareness and reduce gender-based violence. Through a partnership with the government of Chile, we are providing gender-based violence training at the State's Department's International Law Enforcement Academy, ILEA, in San Salvador. Binational centers across the region provide safe spaces for youth to learn English, develop leadership skills, and participate in cultural and academic programs. Research demonstrates that the incidence of gender-based violence is reduced when women have access to economic opportunities and political agency. One of the smartest investments we can make is through empowering women entrepreneurs. Women entrepreneurs play an integral role in shared prosperity in the region, which is why in 2012, President Obama launched the Women's Entrepreneurship in the Americas initiative, also known as We Americas. We Americas builds public-private partnerships that empower women entrepreneurs and improve their access to markets, capital, skills, and capacity building, as well as leadership opportunities. Since its inception, We American has built more than 40 public-private partnerships in over 20 countries and reached over 20,000 women. While we focus on creating opportunities in Central America, we also recognize that some individuals face serious threats and need access to humanitarian protection. For those women, girls, and other individuals who face violence at home, the U.S. government has expanded refugee resettlement opportunities over the past couple of years. In December 2014, the Department of State and Homeland Security launched the Central America Minors Program to provide a safe, legal, and orderly alternative to the dangerous journey that some children have undertaken to join their parents in the United States. The program protects Central Americans at risk by allowing parents with legal status in the United States to request refugee status for their children in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala via the U.S. refugee admissions programs. In November 2016, we announced expansion of the program to allow additional categories of applicants to apply for admission to the United States as a refugee when accompanied by a qualifying child. We are pleased to report that nearly 2,000 individuals have arrived in the United States to reunite with their families thus far. The United States also supports regional cooperation and institutions such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and its rapporteur on women's rights, which play critical roles in promoting access to justice and equal rights for women. Ensuring equal access to justice and equal treatment under the law will contribute immensely to hemispheric security and will enable women to take their rightful place during security discussions. As Secretary of State John Kerry said, we value gender equality, knowing that countries are, in fact, more peaceful and prosperous when women and girls are afforded full rights and, of course, equal opportunity. I urge everyone with an interest in the shared future of the hemisphere, governments, civil society, the private sector, and the incoming administration alike, to continue working for social and economic progress, to raise your voices for the principles that are at the core of democratic and just societies. Know that I will continue to do so after my time as Assistant Secretary. I have often been, in my life, the first woman or the first Latina to break some barriers. And I have seen progress, hard as it may have been, tough as it may have been, come through the years. But unless everyone's voices are heard in the boardroom, in the courtroom, and institutions where policy is made, until men and women alike champion gender equality and understand its link to security and prosperity, we will not hit our mark on these issues. There is no question, we're on the right path. In fact, sometimes it doesn't even feel like it is the right path. But trust me, as long as I have been around and as experienced as I have been and as old as I am, we're getting there. I want to make sure that in these times, I also want to give you the message that in these times of change, where there is a lot of uncertainty, this is the right time not to abandon all the work that we're doing. It doesn't matter where we are. And I know for myself, although I am going to be a federal retiree on January 20th, I have decided that there is no retirement from the community. There is no retirement from the issues that affect women and girls. Because to retire from that, and to retire from that fight, is to retire from life. And I may be retiring from work, but I refuse. It's been too many years, 40 years, fighting. I'm not going anywhere, except to the streets. So, with that, I hope that you have, this panel that will come after me is going to be very enlightening. And I hope it will give us the strength and the energy that I have already received from you. And thank you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Ambassador. I know that you have another engagement, but I think you've set the stage and definitely the momentum for 2017. So thank you very much for your remarks.
Thank you.
Let's go this way.
Thank you all. We're going to just take a 60-second break here so that our panelists can come up on the stage. The ambassador can depart. And if you'll just hang in there and not move too far, we'll get started here in just a minute. Thank you very much. Why don't you all come on up? I just want to take a moment to recognize the Charge d'Affaires from the Embassy of Honduras, who wasn't here at the beginning, but welcome, Mr. Cordero. We appreciate your being with us. And also just two other people, Diana Negroponte, who's a senior fellow here at the Wilson Center, long history of work in Central America. And then I hope she's here, Guadalupe Correa Cabrera, who's a Wilson Center fellow, an expert on organized crime in Mexico, and just completed significant work on the issue of smuggling and trafficking of people from the Northern Triangle through Mexico to the United States. So I just want to recognize those folks. Thank you all again for your patience. We're now going to start a little bit of a discussion, if you will, a conversation focused around the issues of today, the topics that we've been highlighting thus far. We are joined by four experts, passionate leaders, passionate activists on these issues, and so we're delighted to have them all here. We're going to hear first and talk first with two people, Alexander Arriaga and Jane Timoney, both of them with the U.S. Civil Society Working Group that I neglected to say is also a co-sponsor of this event. My apologies. I always miss something important, so thank you. And together they have worked to write a paper called Violence and Insecurity in the Northern Triangle of Central America, Dangerous Choices for Women and Girls. And I think, am I right, there are copies out in the back. Please avail yourself of those. They're also, we have posted this report online, so those of you watching us on the internet, please, on that same page on our Latin America program, you should be able to access that report as well. I'm going to turn first to Alex, who is the managing partner at Strategy for Humanity and senior advisor to Futures Without Violence, where she spearheads their work to eliminate violence against women internationally. She's also a member of the U.S. Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security, and co-author of the report. She's had a long career, well, I shouldn't say long, for being so young, an extensive career in public service, having worked with the Bipartisan Human Rights Caucus in Congress, at the State Department and the Department of Human Rights and Labor, and also at the White House as a special advisor to the President on the Americas. So I'm delighted to welcome her to the stage. She was also Director of Government Relations at Amnesty International, which is where I got to know her, and we worked together there for a number of years. So delighted to have you here. Then we'll also turn to Joan Timoney, Senior Director of Advocacy and External Relations for the Women's Refugee Commission. It's a nonprofit organization that works to improve the lives and protect the rights of women, children, and youth displaced by conflict and crisis. She's also been Vice President for Programs at the Partnership for Public Service and is a member of the U.S. Civil Society Working Group and co-author of the report. Then we'll turn to Claudia Pasipas Bailey. You've heard her referenced already by the ambassador. Claudia was Guatemala's first female attorney general, serving in that capacity from December 2010 to May 2014. In that position, she pursued cases against both the organized criminals of today and the perpetrators of mass human rights violations and abuses in the past. She's currently a senior fellow at the Washington Office on Latin America, and she's a former judge, a lawyer, human rights activist, and just an all-around wonderful person to know. Thank you. And then, last but not least, we have somebody from the Inter-American Development Bank, Carelia Villa. She is substituting last moment for Natalia Alvarado, who came down with one of these mystery viruses. So, Carelia, thank you so much for filling in. I know Carelia because we have a project with the IDB, and so I've grown to appreciate her. She is the Senior Citizen Security Specialist at the IDB. Villa is the focal point for the bank's citizen security and justice work in Central America, and she has more than 15 years of experience supporting state modernization processes in Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you, Carelia, for filling in. So let me get started first by just talking to Alex for a moment. First of all, well, I have two initial questions. One, can you just say very briefly a little bit about the U.S. Civil Society Working Group and how that fits in to the whole women, peace, and security issue? But then, more importantly, what are some of the big findings, some of the headlines, if you will, from your report on Central America and the dangerous choices that women and girls need to make?
Sure. Thank you so much, Eric. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a long admirer of all the contributions you've made in the Americas on human rights, on justice, development, peace, security over decades. Yourself and also Joy Olson, who has just retired as the Executive Director of Washington Office on Latin America, and also has made an enormous imprint in the continent, working with all the extraordinary leaders like Claudia Paz y Paz and so many others. So it's an honor to be here today. I will say first that the U.S. Civil Society Working Group is an extraordinary group of organizations. It assembles a very diverse group. We don't always agree on everything, but what we do agree on is that the United States will do much better in its foreign policy if it addresses issues of women, peace, and security cohesively, so that these organizations come together and really work to make sure that women are at the table, that countries are able to count on the resources of the full population, and that it believes very strongly that in order to be able to have lasting peace, to be able to have smart solutions and policies, the United States really needs to support efforts that integrate women, their voices, and full participation in every aspect of society. That being the premise, that is what unites the groups. And with the leadership of Chantal, who was mentioned earlier today, and also the U.S. Institute of Peace, they've done an extraordinary job to usher this diverse group together. As we look now at the years ahead, what has been achieved in the last several years internationally has been that the international community has truly come to understand the relevance of including women at the table, and the very short-sightedness of trying to move quickly without taking those steps to make sure that all voices are represented. We want to make sure that with the lessons learned of the past, that we apply them in every situation. And I'm hoping to be able to spend some time talking about the links of women and security issues. I also want to acknowledge that the Compton Foundation was instrumental in enabling the writing of this paper. Futures Without Violence has been a leader in this area, and I'm here representing Futures Without Violence, who's done a masterful job domestically and internationally elevating these issues, and the Open Square Foundation. So that is a little bit of the Civil Society Working Group. It continues to write papers in different parts of the world and make recommendations for smart U.S. policy integrating women. So, Eric, then should I start by...
Yeah, talk a little bit about the conclusion, some of the things you're learning, and some of those links that you're talking about between women and security, but particularly in Central America.
Sure. So what we've found is that I think when we look at Central America and we look at the issues of violence against women, let me start by focusing there and just saying that it's really impossible to look at the region without taking into account that the region has been plagued by violence against women now for, at least several decades. And it is critical to look at the civil wars that took place in the 1970s, 80s, and into the 1990s. These civil wars were characterized by systematic, horrific forms of rape, of mutilation, of torture that constituted genocide. During that process, the violence against women specifically was intentional and not only constituted war crimes, but were specifically recognized as a form of genocide. Justice came very delayed, and it took extraordinary efforts by many courageous people to be able to see justice begin to take shape. But the fact that the trials for these war crimes didn't happen for a long time later meant that not only survivors of violence were denied their desire and their right to justice, but also that the circumstances, that the climate in the communities, it served to preserve a climate of fear, of subordination, and of violence against women. And that is a remnant that remains today, and that is the context for a climate that was very long delayed in addressing these violations. We've heard already about how the countries of the region compare to other parts of the world. And we know that in El Salvador and in Guatemala and Honduras, they rank first, third, and seventh, respectively, for rates of female homicide globally. Globally, those three countries. And El Salvador and Guatemala rank first and second in rates of homicide against children and adolescents globally. Now, when we look at this, there are many different factors. I've mentioned the delay in justice and the horrific abuses that took place, and how that had created a situation where without justice and without consequences for those abuses, it became part of the social norm that those are abuses that don't have consequences. What we find now is that the sexual and gender-based violence is prevalent in the region, especially against women and girls, and that the crime rates are among the top 5 in Latin America and are an obstacle to development, according to the World Bank. We also know that trafficking of women and girls and into forced labor and sex is a serious concern in all 3 countries, and that intimate partner violence is a leading form of abuse. And what that tells us is that given how widespread and the high numbers in those countries, it tells us that the social norms have been impacted, and that many of the social norms have failed many women and children and enable the violent crimes to go largely unpunished. We also know that this is a region that has a high level of armed criminal groups, whether they're gangs, narco-traffickers, transnational, local circles of armed criminal groups. And this also plays an important factor. Frequently, the issues of violence against women get excused as, oh, it's just a gang thing. But in fact, it is part of a climate that exists where the value of a woman has been viewed less or more disposable than men. This is not, and I'm speaking very generally, this is not something that, I mean to cast a curtain on everyone, but I'm trying to say very quickly how we get to where we are today as a society. There's an excellent report that was put out recently, which I commend to all of you, which was put out by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, called Women on the Run. And it interviewed women, I believe it was about 160 women. They found that 85% of the women in these countries, these 3 countries described living in neighborhoods under the control of the armed groups, or the maras. The maras have their own, as Ambassador Aponte mentioned, have their own rules. And generally speaking, once you are a gang member, that is your new true family, and whatever you have is the property of the maras. That is the general psychology, again, speaking in broad brush terms. What happens is that in the context of the gang violence is that women are often caught in the middle. If a gangs are fighting each other, then it will be, the retribution will be frequently been taken out on the gang member's property. In other words, the women, the wife, the sister, etc. If there is a gang member who is viewed as having betrayed or abandoned the gang, their most vulnerable possessions are attacked. Again, this would be the women. Some of the state-led interventions that are viewed to combat the narco-trafficking, the drug-related violence, have also at times inadvertently heightened violence because the women have been targeted either as by the traffickers themselves in order to make a statement, either publicly flogging or killing. Or committing a murder in order to make a point. These are some of the things that we have found that leave women with very dangerous choices. They face multiple threats. They're at high risk of violence in their homes in many cases, and also high risk of violence committed by organized criminal armed groups. The violence is devastating to the family unit, but it also provides a very strong impetus for women to leave with their children. And yet when women and children are on the run, they are even more vulnerable to further disenfranchisement, to deepening poverty, and to other forms of abuse. And also just thinking about the country and development perspective, this also has a very harmful impact in terms of having the numbers of people on the move, diminishes economic development, disrupts societal stability, and weakens state security. The last thing I'll say before turning it back, I'd like to talk a little bit about the consequences of violence. It has very lasting impacts. But there's also research that tells us about not just the impact of violence, but how to disrupt it. And there's very important research that has been conducted recently coming out of Texas A&M. Valerie Hudson, Dr. Hudson is the George Bush Chair at the Bush School of Public Service. Do I have that right? I may have gotten her title slightly off, but she has been doing excellent research that really draws the line between violence against women and state security. Her premise is really that, we all know that when a society has undergone severe conflict, that puts stress on the household. But her research, which has collected over 230,000 data points from thousands and thousands of different sources, says that the causal relationship is in the other direction. She says that there's increasing evidence that the causal arrow points in the other direction. In other words, that violence against women and the status of the gender relationships has a causal effect on state stability, because what is experienced in the home and then goes into the community becomes the social norm and feeds the insecurity. I've simplified it, but it's something that we can talk about further.
Great, thanks, Alex. And I would just note your reference to the report from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. He actually presented that here at the Wilson Center, Women on the Run, last March. And he's now gone on to be Secretary General. But if you're interested in that, you can find it on our website as well, that presentation. So thank you. Joan, let me turn to you for just a second. You work for Women's Refugee Commission. You follow these issues from the vantage point of refugees and migration. Alex has talked about the broad societal violence, the violence that people experience, that women experience at home, and how that impacts. But we haven't talked about the migration part of it. Talk to me a little bit about displacement and migration and how this violence is impacting the whole issue of internal displacement and migration.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Eric. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I think I'll back up for 1 second, say something about the U.S. National Action Plan. I mean, what the U.S. National Action Plan says is that long-term peace and stability can only be achieved if women are equal partners in decision-making and political processes and conflict mediation, that protection systems are in place. It also has a pillar or an element around access to humanitarian relief. And I think it's the sort of protection and access to humanitarian relief piece that's going to inform some of what I'm saying about displacement, internal displacement, refugee movements. And so I'd like to start there. And I think the most important thing about the plan is those are the elements that contribute to long-term peace and stability. But the starting point was it's in the U.S. national interest that this happen, and it's in the U.S. national interest to support women in this role. And so with that as our starting point, I'm probably also greatly inspired by the ambassador right now. So I may be a little. But, you know, the conditions that the ambassador was talking about, that Alex was talking about, have, forced increasing numbers of people to flee their homes, either to find safety, try to find safety inside their own country, or to move across the border and see if, for asylum in neighboring countries. And I think our organization would say there are really troubling signs of an unfolding humanitarian crisis. And just to start first with internal displacement, look, the data remains fragmentary, but there are, I think, alarming indications of the potential scale of the problem. Particularly in Honduras and Salvador. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in Geneva estimated at the end of 2015 there were some 1 million people displaced by organized criminal violence in the Northern Triangle in Mexico. This kind of displacement tends to be hidden, unacknowledged, poorly addressed. I mean, when it was doing its report, the center said, people trapped in these circumstances were overlooked and off the grid. So if you're overlooked and off the grid, that means your protection and assistance needs are going unaddressed. And when you're forced to flee from your home, even just internally, right, probably means you've lost your home, probably lost your job, your source of income. If you have savings, they begin to dwindle fast. You have challenges getting access to housing or basic services. Are the kids even in school? Do they have any access to school at all? And you could begin to see a downward spiral there. And I think for women and girls, the topic today, those risks go right up. The risks of gender-based violence, you're perceived to probably be exceptionally vulnerable by people who do see you in these situations, probably assuming you'll never be able to report. So you have increased risks of sexual assault. In a lot of cases of internal displacement globally, you do see domestic violence go up too. And I think it's because the traditional networks have disappeared, or because in displacement, men who may have been used to being the breadwinner taking care of their families can no longer do that. You can appreciate and imagine the incredible frustration and fear that gets generated there, and the impact that can have on domestic violence. Sexual exploitation and abuse. You don't have you don't have enough for your family. You can't get basic services, so you may be forced into prostitution. Another point I wanted to make, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Internally Displaced Persons made a visit to Honduras in 2015, I think it was, and he did a report on that visit, and he also noted the need, for example, for safe shelters for internally displaced women and girls who are at risk of violence. We can come back to that maybe in the recommendations. So there's urgent issues, right, for the safety and well-being of the individual, but I think, too, we know from other situations of internal displacement, there's also, if it's not addressed, there's also consequences for stability and development in the countries themselves if these issues aren't addressed head-on. And I would say that I think Honduras has been more forward-leaning on this issue. In late 2013, it created an interagency commission for the protection of persons displaced by violence. And the commission did a survey, and the survey from the data, from that survey informs the IDMC's estimate for Honduras, the Displacement Monitoring Center's estimates for Honduras displacement. Also, there was a regional conference in San Jose last summer, organized by UNHCR and the Organization of American States. The first conference, I think, in the region to address the current issues around protection and forced displacement. And Honduras did make a series of specific commitments on addressing internal displacement at that conference. And I know El Salvador has also started working with UNHCR to do a more comprehensive profiling of internal displacement in that country. I think much more needs to be done to put the frameworks in place, the legal, policy, programmatic frameworks in each country to address internal displacement, associated budgeting to go with those frameworks, much better data collection. As I said, the data right now is fragmented. We're relying on estimates, so we need more precise figures on the actual numbers, and maybe more, just as importantly, the nature of that displacement. Sex and age disaggregated data, a much richer understanding of what's actually happening to people so that you can develop the right kinds of interventions to address their needs and people can be safe in their own country. Otherwise, you know, your only choice, what would you do? Your only choice is to flee, really, and we've seen increasing numbers of women and families doing that. And Eric mentioned, as did Alex, UNHCR's report, Women on the Run. So that was a survey of refugee women from the Northern Triangle in Mexico who had status in the United States. And the majority of those interviewed, the majority of the women interviewed, 80% of Hondurans, 78% of Salvadorans, I think it was something like 58% of the Guatemalan women had tried to relocate internally before deciding to become a refugee, to try and seek asylum. And right now, of course, most are trying to get to the United States to do that, in part because they may have family members, in part because right now it's very challenging to access asylum in some of the neighboring countries for various reasons. So you embark on this treacherous journey, and we were talking about the now Secretary General. I think when he was talking about the Women on the Run report, he referred to that journey as a journey through hell. So, and you say, you know, because for everything that was raised earlier about the threats along the route, the extortion, everything that probably many of you in this room know. So then you say, you know, gosh, think of the desperation that makes you do that. And I was reading something that a Salvadoran woman said as part of her interview with UNHCR, and she was talking about why she decided to make the journey. And she said, well, coming here was like having hope that you'll come out alive. So I think, you know, it's that level of human fear, I guess, that we need to remember people are dealing with when they make this journey. And lastly, really quickly, I wanted to say something about the U.S. border. The U.S. National Action Plan focuses on policy and practice in countries affected by conflict, crises, fragile countries. It doesn't really talk about, say, a situation at the border, but I wanted to do it today, and we included it in our paper because I think the protection issues are of a piece, right? It's in part the protection in your own country. It's what happens when you're on the move trying to secure refugee status. And then in this particular crisis, I think we have to say something about the border. And Central American women and girls apprehended at the border right now face a variety of challenges accessing asylum. Many would be legitimate asylum seekers, but they don't know how to file a claim. They don't know how to pursue, or they don't file or pursue a claim. As I think most of you know, you have to specifically express a fear of return in order to take the next step in our complex process. And with the current emphasis on deterring arrivals at the border, there's various fast-track deportation procedures in place right now that organizations like ours are concerned undermine due process for people who would otherwise be deserving of protection. And I think there's also the reality that even if you express a fear of return, single women and women with families are detained or initially detained when they arrive. And so sometimes families are separated, with women being in adult facilities and their children sent to children's shelters, another issue of concern, I think. If you are released from detention and you have passed that initial stage where you do have the right to file a claim, the courts are so backlogged now that in those situations it can take up to 3 years. So I think between the basic lack of information, between a whole set of cases that fall under prioritization of deportation and expedited removal, married to the length of time it's taking to actually get to court if you fall in that category. I think all of that combined is causing a number of people to be returned to unsafe circumstances. So I'll stop there. I know we'll have a chance to come back to, given this, what are the recommendations, and I look forward to sharing those.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joan. I'm going to turn now to Claudia Paz, and I neglected to state that Claudia would like to respond, talk, speak in Spanish. So if you do need a translation, a device to listen in on the translation, and you don't have one, if you would please raise your hand, we will make sure you get one. If not, there's one I think up here. So let me turn to Claudia quickly. Claudia, when you came into office as the Attorney General, Fiscal General of Guatemala, you faced a number of enormous challenges, one of which was the immense violence and destructiveness of organized crime. That was one of the big challenges you faced. Is there anything you can tell us about that experience, on how organized crime impacts women in particular? What kind of experience do they have with it? Because we tend to think of it as just a lot of crime and violence, but really understanding some of the specifics of how it impacts women, I think, is very important.
Gracias, Eric, por la pregunta, por la invitación y por permitirme hablar en español. Creo que cuando pensamos en la relación crimen organizado, violencia contra las mujeres, hay que tener en cuenta un dato que es muy importante, y es que al analizar la magnitud de la violencia contra las mujeres, las características de la violencia contra las mujeres, tenemos que partir de que de cada 5 casos, 3 de violencia contra las mujeres, sea violencia sexual, violencia física o incluso si hablamos de feminicidios, son producidas por su entorno más cercano, por sus familias. Y traigo este dato a colación porque la familia sería un lugar donde las personas pensarían que están a salvo, es el lugar donde todos entenderíamos que tenemos protección, pero si en ese lugar es en donde las mujeres somos más vulnerables de sufrir violencia, es una causa para dejar nuestros países y para buscar refugio o asilo en los países vecinos o desplazamiento interno en Estados Unidos. Lo digo por esto, pero esto no significa que el crimen organizado o las redes criminales que se dediquen al crimen organizado no ejerzan formas especiales de violencia contra las mujeres. Una, por supuesto, es la trata. Y si vemos cuáles son las principales causantes, en mi experiencia de violencia en nuestros 3 países, yo me referiría a organizaciones vinculadas con el narcotráfico en áreas rurales, especialmente en las fronteras, y a las pandillas en áreas urbanas. Es violencia instrumental, porque estas organizaciones criminales tienen sus ganancias de otros tipos de tráfico de armas, del tráfico de drogas, del lavado de dinero, y si hablamos de las pandillas, de la extorsión. Pero en ambos casos las mujeres sufren formas particulares de violencia. Si lo vemos relacionado con el narcotráfico, creo que un elemento que tenemos que tener presente es que en los 3 países, en Guatemala, Honduras y El Salvador, estamos hablando de estados que tienen una presencia institucional muy débil, y en algunas zonas del país prácticamente no tienen ninguna presencia. Es decir, que quienes ejercen el poder y el control del territorio en estas zonas son lo que llamamos los capos del narcotráfico. Y en estas circunstancias, lo que nosotros enfrentamos desde la Fiscalía eran situaciones de esclavitud sexual, donde las mujeres no tenían más ninguna opción de oponerse a la voluntad de esta poderosa persona que ejercía el control en este territorio, y tampoco tenían acceso en estos lugares a la justicia porque eran lugares donde o los funcionarios policiales, fiscales o judiciales se sentían intimidados o habían sido corrompidos por el narcotráfico. Si lo vemos con relación a las pandillas, y ya Alejandra señaló un poco de esto, es una situación similar de control territorial. Y acá las mujeres sufren violencia ya sea porque les forzan a integrarse con las pandillas, ya sea porque deciden abandonar las pandillas y es una forma de traición a estas organizaciones criminales, ya sea porque la pandilla rival las ve como un objeto de violencia para golpear a sus familiares, para golpear a sus novios, para golpear a sus parientes que están involucrados dentro de estos grupos criminales. Es decir, en ambos casos vemos que esta violencia impacta de manera particular a las mujeres y un poco sobre las características de esta violencia. Tiene un contenido sexual, por supuesto, y en los casos de violencia contra las mujeres, aunque en magnitud, si comparamos homicidios con femicidios, son mucho menores, en el nivel de ensañamiento en contra del cuerpo de las mujeres y de exposición de la violencia, que tiene un contenido simbólico, es muchísimo mayor en el caso de femicidios que en el caso de homicidios.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say I'm guessing that that kind of analysis of how organized crime affects women is really not common. It's not the analysis that's generally done. Would that be accurate?
En general, la violencia contra las mujeres tiende a ser invisibilizada y tiende a ser relegada como no importante, como algo que no debe estar en el centro de las políticas de justicia y seguridad. Y en el caso del crimen organizado, no son de las víctimas más visibles de su violencia, pero no es que no lo sean.
Sí, sí. Ambassador Ponte mentioned, and I wanted to come back to this, the formation of specialized tribunals, specialized courts in Guatemala that operated 24/7. Now, I'm pretty sure that you had some involvement in that process. Could you say a little bit about why you thought that was necessary? Why was that a priority? And why you thought it was important to do that?
Quizás debemos de partir de un dato, y es que la magnitud de la violencia contra las mujeres es el delito más denunciado. O sea, no puede ser un delito que sea ignorado por las autoridades. En el caso de Guatemala estamos hablando de más de 50,000 denuncias por año. Y me imagino que existe una situación similar en El Salvador y en Honduras. Y si bien en los últimos años, en este siglo, han habido políticas específicas para enfrentar este problema, como la aprobación de nueva legislación que tipifica el delito de violencia contra la mujer como un delito, que eso es algo muy reciente, o que tipifica de mejor forma la violencia sexual, porque, por ejemplo, en Guatemala hace 15 años, si el perpetrador contraía matrimonio con la víctima, pues ya no había delito. A pesar de esos esfuerzos normativos, habían graves problemas para la atención de casos de violencia contra las mujeres y de violencia sexual. Voy a citar algunos. Las mujeres sufrían revictimización, las mujeres desistían de sus casos por la enorme burocracia que tenían que enfrentar para tener acceso a la justicia. Las mujeres tenían que escoger entre tener atención médica, por ejemplo, después de una violación sexual, o tener acceso a la justicia. Y ni los fiscales, ni los jueces, ni la policía entendía la importancia de darle un tratamiento rápido a estos casos. La idea para enfrentar estos problemas, y no es una idea que surge conmigo, sino fue un trabajo del fiscal anterior, Amílcar Velázquez Zárate, que nosotros perfeccionamos y que afortunadamente la fiscal actual, Telma Aldana, ha continuado, fue establecer en una sola oficina toda la atención que necesitan las mujeres, reunir atención psicológica, atención médico forense, fiscales, policías y jueces, para que fuera el sistema el que trabajara alrededor de las mujeres sobrevivientes de violencia y no las mujeres que tuvieran que ir de oficina en oficina, venga mañana, regrese pasado, porque ya no volvían. Y este sistema de atención integral se estableció, como mencionó la embajadora Aponte, las 24 horas del día, los 365 días de la semana, porque no es que suframos violencia de 8 a 4, ni que suframos violencia de lunes a viernes, sino era justamente en estas otras horas cuando era más importante tener esta atención y esta atención integral. Hay que decirlo, en los lugares donde se ha establecido este sistema, que no es en todo el país desafortunadamente, pero en lugares donde se ha establecido este sistema de atención a la violencia sexual y a violencia contra las mujeres, los femicidios han disminuido. Es decir, que lo que siempre decíamos, la atención temprana de casos de violencia contra la mujer puede salvar una vida. Ahora tenemos estadísticas para demostrarlo.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll come back to everybody in just a minute, but I wanted to also talk to Karelia Villa from the Inter-American Development Bank briefly. Karelia, you work in the public security sector. You all conduct research and learning about problems of public security, but also have programs in Central America to address those. Can you give us a little bit about what are the things that the bank has learned? Why is violence against women a development issue that a development bank should address? What are some of the findings that you've had?
Well, we want to thank you, the Wilson Center, for this invitation, and we are very glad continue working with you in different initiatives in our region. And as you know, the Americas is the first region in the world that has a regional convention, the Belém do Pará Convention, that commits all national governments to eliminate violence against women. Living lives without violence is a basic human right for women, but despite the Belém Convention, this is far from reality. The violence against women is a serious obstacle for our region's economic and social development. Violence against women has important cost and socioeconomic consequences for the population. Recent estimates by the IDB suggest that on average, the cost of violence for Latin American countries is 3% of the GDP. In the countries of the Northern Triangle alone, the economic cost of violence is 5% of GDP. And this is a recent book that we are going to publish very soon. Also, not-fatal violence significantly impacts women productivity. A study by the IDB found that women wage losses due to intimate partner violence costs Nicaragua 1.6% of GDP and Chile 2% of GDP. A more recent study for Colombia found losses of GDP amounting 2.2%, as well as significantly higher unemployment rates among women survivors of violence. Due to these circumstances of violence, women are leaving the region, but also many of them that stay behind continue to face lack of opportunities and living in a context of crime and violence. In most extreme cases, they end up committing crimes and lead them to prison. Indeed, the Americas is the region with the highest percentage of women in prison, with some Central American countries in the top 10 for this list. The women also have very limited resources for their rehabilitation and future social inclusion, with the average funding for the correctional system of 0.15% of GDP. This makes them more vulnerable to return to a life of violence as victims or perpetrators. Thus, addressing violence against women is a core element for the IDB work to promote social and economic development in the region. Let me explain very quickly what the IDB is doing. We are working with different units at the bank, for example, the Gender and Diversity Unit, and also the Institutional Strengthening Division is where the cluster of citizen security is. We are working in 3 pillars in order to coordinate our work. First, offering quality service to survivors. Two, is investing in preventing activities to reduce the prevalence of violence in the region. And third, producing information and conducting research about what works and share this information with our region. Referring to offer quality service to our survivors, we seek to improve the quality and coverage programs to prevent and address violence against women. For example, as many of you are comment, we have a flagship program in El Salvador, Ciudad Mujer, that offers this kind of model that our speaker, Claudia Paz, speak about in Guatemala. This is a one-stop shop that offers quality integrated service to women that includes psychological and legal support for survivors of violence, vocational training, labor market intermediation, business development service, microcredit, and sexual and reproductive health services. Also, we complement these one-stop shop services available in Ciudad Mujer. We are partnering with the NGO Promundo to promote transformation for social and cultural norms in the community, such as the model of transforming violent masculinity through interventions with the H&M program in the community surrounding Ciudad Mujer. Also, as many of you are familiar with the IMAGE program in South Africa, which produced a stunning result of 55% reduction in violence against women by combining a standard microcredit program with interventions to help women live lives free of violence. So we take this program and we replicate and adapt this program in Peru, and right now we are conducting an evaluation, an impact evaluation, in order to see if we can scale up this program in other parts of our region. And in line with the promotion of women economic empowerment that we see that it really works, we are complementing the comprehension attention model, or the Modelo de Atención Integral in Guatemala, implemented by the Office of the Prosecutor, which is to help women who are victims of violence to develop self-esteem and achieve economic independence. And also, we have recently begun rehabilitation programs for women in the correctional system in Central America. For example, in El Salvador, we are working with the Programa Yo Cambio, and in Costa Rica also, we are helping in order to improve the infrastructure and rehabilitation model in the correctional system. And in the second area of our work regarding to prevention activities to reduce the prevalence of violence, we see that one of ways to ensure effective prevention is the building of solid institutions. We need to invest in capable human capital who are sensitized about this problem. Key institutions include police, the Office of Prosecutor, the courts, among others that are key to prevent and tackle violence against women. For example, in Honduras, through our loan to police reform, we introduced a change in the police curriculum to better prepare the police officers on how to respond to women who are victims of violence. At the same time, we have promoted more female participation between the police forces. Again, in Guatemala, we think the access to justice is also a key part of the equation to reduce impunity. So we just approved a loan that the main objective is to strengthen the capacities of the Public Prosecutor's Office with a focus on investigation of crimes related to violence against women. And in the third part of our pillars, to produce information and research about what works in this area, one of most depressing facts in the area is the lack of evidence of what works. So the IDB is investing significant resources to study this intervention and offer quality service to its survivors. Some examples of this is the supporting that we are doing in Mexico in order to implementing a data analysis platform in order to see what is the information available in the country to this phenomenon, and to facilitate a timing and accurate analysis of data to inform public policy decisions. We also are conducting penitentiary surveys in Central America to characterize the profile of women who are in prison. And in this way, to have more information in order to design more suitable rehabilitation programs for this region. Also, we are implementing victimization surveys about violence against women in the Caribbean countries, and we hope that very soon we can do it in other regions of Latin America. The IDB also is preparing a book about the cause of violence, and we have a chapter related to violence against women, and also we have a review of the different interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean of what works, what are the interventions that what works. And this is what we are doing.
Thank you. Appreciate it. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to shift because you were finished. You were suggesting a number of activities and approaches and recommendations. So I think what I'm going to do is ask our panelists just briefly to talk a little bit about recommendations that you have from your work for people, for governments actually, and the international community to adopt. And then we should have a good bit of time for people to ask questions from the audience. So hang in there, folks. We'll get to you. Alex, you want to start us off, or?
I look to my partner here because we've been working very closely. I wanted to say just one word about as we look at these issues. A lot has happened, and that the attention that's been happening at the international level, whether it's the United Nations, the IDB, the World Bank, is making a difference in investing in solutions. Countries themselves are also investing heavily and working with research institutions to figure out what works and to scale up efforts that work. And the United States has taken, from everything we heard from Ambassador Aponte, several initiatives collaboratively with countries in the region in order to identify what works, support efforts, and scale up. But the problems are massive, and they require intentional, very practical, and very strategic attention. One word that I wanted just to highlight that I touched on briefly, but that as we're looking at prevention, if we're really looking at long-term prevention of violence against women, we're not equating women and children, but the two issues need to be addressed. If we're looking at the issues of violence against women, and we're looking at long-term solutions, it's really important to start very young, and to start young working with men and boys. To also work with men and boys, to start working very early with girls and with boys on issues of equality and respect and what healthy relationships look like. It also means that we have to address the trauma that happens when children have been exposed to violence. And we know from research that unless you're looking at violence against women issues and really addressing strategies to end violence against women, you will be ineffective in dealing with ending violence against children. So you can't even focus exclusively on the children without also focusing on what's happening with women, according to research. So it's important to look at these. It's also important to recognize the growing body of science that shows us not only what we've all sort of figured out, that there are consequences to violence, but the science now tells us very specific kinds of consequences that have to do with, especially in early ages, brain development, issues about isolation, depression, and about lack of empathy, and how these are scientifically demonstrated to put people at greater, these are impairments that can put people at greater risk of perpetuating violence, but also of engaging with organized violent groups. And so if we're looking at issues of how to stop organized violence and even issues of violent extremism, this is one of the indicators that the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has demonstrated, that domestic violence, violence in the home, it's all part of a continuum, and we need to look at this as a security issue because it will be an important indicator, and it is something that changes the norms. So really looking carefully at the science and taking the cues and looking at how to prevent violence, having an integrated approach, issues of how to deal with children exposure to violence and development issues. Without, without addressing the underlying discrimination against women, the gender inequalities and impunity, the crime rates will continue high and fuel additional insecurity. So the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security is one of the tools that the United States has. It is an excellent tool. It offers an effective policy framework. It also has a menu of very flexible evidence-based interventions. It enables the U.S. to invest in conflict resolution, violence prevention, economic development, and peace building to be more intentional in including women as equal partners. And this is an approach that is absolutely critical to the countries that we're talking about today in the Northern Triangle in order to really support the efforts to transform and become more stable and prosperous. The last thing that I'd like to say on this is that there's been a lot of talk about what if we just improve if we build the wall and it's a better wall, right? Will that insulate the United States from these security issues? And, I think that most of us recognize that the world is just too small a place. The United States cannot isolate itself fully and cannot guarantee that it will be immune from threats beyond its borders. But I also like to think of the Assistant Secretary of State, Bill Brownfield, who's the Assistant Secretary for International Narcotics Law Enforcement at the State Department, who also served in many Latin American countries. He says, if we ignore these threats, these problems, and these crises in Central America today, we will address them on our own front porches tomorrow. So I think we have the data. We know what works. It's a matter of really being intentional, the investments, and scaling up and looking at these issues of inequality and of really investing early on as well.
Joan, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just quickly, you can see the full set of recommendations obviously in the paper, but I just wanted to pull out a couple around displacement. So one was on internal displacement, recommending, so our recommendations are really directed at the U.S. government, in its diplomacy and in its assistance approaches, urge greater attention to the problem of internal displacement, including immediate sort of emergency access to basic services and safe shelters for women and girls, but also supporting our partner countries to develop the national strategies to address internal displacement and to include internally displaced persons in national development plans. So that's one specifically related to internal displacement. We also have a recommendation on improving the centers that have been created now for migrants who are forced to return but may still be at risk. And I think there's a number of those centers, the ambassador mentioned it too, but I'm thinking back to what the Special Rapporteur's report talked about, and those are pretty basic centers. And so I think to really provide assistance and protection, they probably need additional resources and additional capacity to be able to better monitor how people are doing and to provide specific support, referrals, and so on for those who have immediate protection needs, particularly women and girls, and support programs that help them better integrate, right? If you're really going to have a safer future if you are returned in these situations. We have a couple recommendations that the things the U.S. can do to support efforts that are now starting in the other neighboring countries to improve asylum systems. I mean, it's everything from providing technical assistance on asylum and refugee law and technical assistance on the vulnerabilities of women and children in these situations, how to recognize them and what you should do. I think it's working with partner countries, with UNHCR, to ensure that reception facilities in some of these neighboring countries meet minimum standards, that if people can come there, they know how to seek asylum, they get basic care they need if that's the initial issue, and if they are accepted as refugees going forward in more neighboring countries, that you can integrate successfully. You have access to education systems, access to economic opportunity. We also included a recommendation. I think the San Jose conference I mentioned has an action statement where parties make certain commitments and pledges to do things. I think, first of all, the U.S. should honor the ones it made, and then on top of that, I think we should encourage in our diplomacy and our partnerships that all countries report as pledged on how they're doing at the upcoming OAS meeting in June. And I guess we would say if entities could report by gender, include a gender analysis in that, I think that would be hugely helpful to see how we're doing, including for women and girls. And then here at home, we have a set of recommendations that really to ensure that the U.S. meets its own responsibilities under the Refugee Convention, making sure that everyone who needs protection can access it, and consistent with what we would say is due process. We have a recommendation around alternatives to detention in the U.S., increasing resources for the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security because they are so overstretched, so that we can do a better job on due process and more efficient adjudication, fair, efficient adjudication of claims. And lastly, acknowledging that gender-based violence, including gang violence, domestic violence, can be grounds for asylum in certain circumstances, and making sure that here in our own country we're adjudicating those cases consistently, which is not the case right now. So, thank you.
Claudia, do you have any recommendations either to the countries of Central America or the international community how to further these issues?
Quizás dos recomendaciones, una examinando la situación de violencia en general en los tres países. Creo que tenemos los números más altos del mundo como región en cuanto a violencia homicida, pero sin embargo han habido reducciones importantes este último año y en Guatemala durante ya un lapso mayor de tiempo, desde a partir del 2009 que tuvimos el pico de estas tasas terribles de muertes violentas. Y si vemos detenidamente a qué se deben, yo me atrevería a afirmar acá que los tres países, las políticas que han sido más efectivas para enfrentar el crimen organizado y disminuir los niveles de violencia han venido desde el sistema de justicia. Entonces, si estamos pensando en programas de apoyo, en programas de lucha contra el crimen organizado, debemos mirar más y enfocarnos en las instituciones de justicia. Estoy hablando de ministerios públicos, organismos judiciales y policías de investigación. Y una es específica en relación a la violencia contra las mujeres. Por supuesto que soy una convencida de que el sistema penal debe intervenir en casos de violencia contra la mujer, de violencia sexual, pero no lo puede hacer solo. Las cifras son abrumadoras y el sistema colapsa si no se implementan medidas preventivas efectivas que disminuyan estos niveles de violencia contra las mujeres tan altos. Medidas que incluyen, por supuesto, medidas educativas y de sensibilización y de visibilización del problema de violencia contra las mujeres en nuestros países, pero también medidas que incluyan acceso a salud, acceso a trabajo, acceso a educación y que permitan disminuir la brecha de exclusión de la que somos víctimas.
Good. Carelia, do you want to add any last thing?
Yes, well, one of the most promising interventions that we have seen in the region is, as we said, these comprehensive models that we have in the region. In this moment, we see this intervention in Guatemala, in Mexico through the Centros de Justicia, in Peru, in El Salvador. But we think that is a very important intervention that we can scale up in other countries in the region. And the most important thing is to complement this intervention with the women's economic empowerment and autonomy in order to avoid the reinsertion in this cycle of violence of the woman. Also, a very important thing for the governments is to document successes and impacts. It's very important to share with the region the experience and to diffuse these interventions because we need to know what is working in the region in this area. And also we can see that local ownership in the project is important in order to success. We need the local ownership of the authorities when we are implementing this type of projects in order to have better results.
Great. Okay, we have about 20 minutes for questions from folks in the audience. I'm even willing to take some questions from people on the fifth floor if they would like to participate. But let me start up here. I'm going to take 3 questions, and I will call first on Armando over here, Armando Trull, local journalist and expert on Central America. We have a question here and then one behind there as well. So Armando, why don't you lead us off?
Thank you, Eric. I guess my question is, a lot of the recommendations that you've made and a lot of the policies that have been instituted to a certain degree has been done through U.S. money and the Alliance for Progress and the Northern Triangle and so forth. So my question is, given a new administration, sorry, but that's the elephant in the room, right? So given a new administration, how are you going to sell those policies to an administration that perhaps may not be interested in hearing the solutions that you are advocating here?
Fair enough. Yes, there was a question right here.
Yeah, Chantal Lyon-Artat from WISE. I have a question actually for all panelists. If you look at the Women, Peace and Security Agenda or the U.S. National Action Plan, it's really about 2 ideas. One is protection, the other is participation. And in recent years, protection has been the mobilizer, but the solution is really in participation and political participation. And I haven't heard you talk about political participation. Are we listening enough to the women who are under threat? And what does the political participation in these countries actually look like?
Great. And there was a question behind there. The gentleman there, midway to the back.
Thank you. I have 2 short questions. First of all, we often focus on those who are migrating internationally, but there are certainly huge numbers of internal migrants and families that have been badly disrupted by male members being killed, imprisoned, women who are sent to prison who have children. To what extent do we have to deal with this as a fundamental part of the problem? And the second one, which is very short, is simply to say the situation in Nicaragua, while still serious, certainly seems much less dangerous, profound for women than in the Northern Triangle. Is there anything that can be learned from the Nicaraguan experience?
In case you didn't recognize that voice, that's Professor Richard Millett. So thank you, Richard, for your questions. Joan, you want to go first?
Sure. So the new administration, I think several things. I think that one of the things we've learned about the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, as it's called, is that what's behind that is this is what sound, effective investment looks like. And that if you want to achieve stability and prosperity long term, you have to make these kinds of investments. So I guess I'm hoping and assuming that that case is one that will resonate. I also think that with the U.S. increasing its attention and assistance to address root causes, and including the short-term continuing resolution that was just passed by the Congress, maintained, at least for now, the funding level of the previous year, which is a significant increase over the year before. And so I guess when I'm thinking that there may be that bipartisan commitment to continue to address root causes in the region for various reasons. But if that's the case, then to me you have both the opportunity and the imperative in addressing root causes with partners to really get at the set of issues we've been talking about today. So I guess I am hopeful from that perspective, and I'm hopeful if when the new people come in and actually look at what the data shows about why these investments make sense, that will prevail. And I was going to say a quick thing in response to Chantal's question about political participation. You know, one of the benefits of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the work that's been done around gender in the U.S. government to date is that you have USAID, for example, really pushing to have a gender analysis done across all its programming areas, which gets a little bit at, it's not just about protection, it's about the whole range of things the U.S. does across sectors, political, security, economic, humanitarian, that together really get you where you need to go in terms of women's empowerment and protection and prevention. And I noticed when I was looking at the USAID Honduras strategy for the next, I I guess it's 4 years or so, they were talking about the need, actually I'll read it, it says a more democratic supporting in Honduras a more democratic gender sensitive culture so that men and women on equal terms can participate equally in decision making, particularly in the political arena. And so I think, to me, that just emphasizes reminds us why that cross-sectoral piece is really ultimately what's going to get us where we need to go. So I'll stop there for.
Alex, did you want to?
Just going to add, you hit on the points that I was thinking, especially I think everybody has mentioned the comprehensive approach, that it really is what it takes. It can't be only one piece, only education, only empowerment, only justice. It really has to be an analysis that takes a look at where the gaps are, where the strengths are. The other thing that I think that has happened over the last several years is that there's been this understanding that comprehensive approach is necessary. There's also been a lot of interest in data collection and in figuring out what works. So we have a growing amount of information about what initiatives are promising and are going back to actually do those rigorous studies to see what needs to be scaled up. And I know that, for example, somebody mentioned Nicaragua. There has been some promising initiatives there that build on the type of work that has happened in other parts of the world, whether it's here in the United States or whether it's in Uganda. There's certain types of approaches that are proven to work and are being tested, and those are the types of initiatives that we should be scaling up. We have that information at this point. The other thing that I'd say about the new administration, yes, I also believe that we can find areas of common ground, that these are issues that, the treatment of women and the treatment of children and the success of societies and the treatment of men, when we're talking about gender-based violence, that these are issues that we can agree no one ought to be treated X, right? That these, in the end, are security issues. And that if we're going to really focus on U.S. interests and national security, we have to be looking at these as security concerns. And we have to be supporting the efforts in country with the partners in country who know the situation best, and invest locally and with the country's governments in order to build up in these areas that we know where the investments will be smart. So I share the same sense of uncertainty as everybody else, but at the same time, I think that these issues are too important. We have to find the common ground, and I believe that there are people of goodwill on all sides that are interested in learning from what has been gained and moving forward as well.
Claudia or Aurelia?
Quizás un poco sobre la pregunta acerca de la participación política de las mujeres. Puedo hablar por Guatemala, que es lo que más conozco, aunque me imagino que hay una situación similar en Salvador y en Honduras, y es que las mujeres hemos sido históricamente excluidas de esa participación. Si vemos las cifras en el Congreso de la República, es alrededor del 10% de las congresistas son mujeres. Si lo vemos en el poder local, la situación es aún más dramática. La cifra baja al 5% de mujeres alcaldesas. Y creo que en justicia es en uno de los pocos espacios que en el país donde las mujeres hemos ganado un protagonismo mayor. Mi presencia en la Fiscalía, la fiscal actual, como un símbolo también de lucha contra la corrupción y a favor del Estado de Derecho. Pero hay mucho por hacer y eso pasa por reformas a la ley electoral y de partidos políticos que garanticen una participación equitativa de las mujeres. Y totalmente coincido que es parte de la solución es garantizar este acceso a puestos de ejercicio del poder por el enorme contenido, no solo por una cuestión de democracia, que somos la mitad del país, sino también por el enorme contenido simbólico que significa y cómo esto puede ser una forma de prevenir la violencia en contra nuestra. Unas palabras sobre Nicaragua, siempre ha sido un lugar a ver. O sea, en tasas de homicidio tienen una tasa muchísimo menor que las que tenemos en Salvador, Honduras y Guatemala. Y una respuesta rápida, en la que seguro coincidimos, que es un tema de instituciones fuertes e instituciones al servicio de la población, y en eso hay mucho que aprender acerca de la policía que ha funcionado en Nicaragua y sus programas de prevención comunitaria.
Just in this line, regarding Nicaragua, yes, we think that the police of Nicaragua is one of the most confident trust for the citizens in the region. And also, we think that regarding the situation of the correctional system in the region, and especially the women in the correctional system, we have seen a progress in the prioritize of this specific topic in the region. I remember when we started working in 2011 in the SICA, Central America Strategy for Citizen Security, and we studied that the international cooperation for the correctional system in the region of Central America, it was only 1% in comparison with other areas like prevention or institutional strengthening or control. So we start seeing in this region that the countries are prioritize this problem, and it's very important to focus invest in this area. Thank you.
I can't resist. I have to ask Claudia another question, and I apologize for this. But it goes to the issue of participation. Before we came up here, we did a little interview for our online program called Women on the Move. It's part of the Global Women Leadership Initiative. And one of the questions I asked you is, how did you decide to compete to become Attorney General of Guatemala? And you told a very, I thought, impactful anecdote. Could I get you to repeat that? Would that be okay? I mean, you've recorded it. It will be public. So
You might as well.
you might as well, right? No, but it goes to this issue of participation. So if you don't, would you do that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
Estábamos viviendo un momento muy especial en Guatemala. En aquel entonces era medio año del 2010. Había habido una elección de fiscal general. Esta elección se había anulado porque se habían denunciado vínculos de la persona nombrada con el crimen organizado, y estaba recién iniciando un nuevo proceso de elección de fiscal general, y yo estaba viendo la elección, quienes decidían, que eran los decanos de facultades, Corte Suprema, quienes presentaban sus currículums, y le digo al compañero que estaba al lado mío, ¿ves que no hay mujeres? Son hombres los que deciden, son hombres los que presentan sus currículums. Otra vez estamos excluidas. Y él se me volteó a ver y me dijo, pues, ¿por qué no participan las mujeres? ¿Por qué no presentas tu currículum? Y me di cuenta del enorme peso que tenía en mí el haber siempre visto varones en puestos de poder, que yo no me había visto presentando mi currículum para competir. Y tenía por supuesto, un temor terrible de qué iba a significar para mi vida personal, para mi vida familiar, y si iba a estar a la altura de las circunstancias. No me había visto como fiscal general. Y por supuesto, la decisión ya se sabe, decidí participar, pero tuvo un efecto muy importante, y yo lo conté. Éramos 46 candidatos en aquel entonces y éramos 4 mujeres. Las elecciones de fiscal general ahora, lo conté. Éramos mitad candidatas mujeres y mitad candidatos varones.
Wow.
¿Cómo había cambiado? Y la lista que va para el presidente son 3 hombres y 3 mujeres. La lista que fue cuando a mí me nombró el presidente Colón eran 5 varones y la única mujer era yo.
Good, thank you. All right, we have time for maybe 2 more questions if you can keep them short. So let's see. Any questions out there? Oh, sorry. Missed you right there. Could you just tell us who your name and...
My name's Cornelia Weiss, and I thank you all very much. And I'd like to go back to Nicaragua, because the last time I looked at that, which was a few years ago, at that time, the police was headed by a woman, and a significant percentage of the police force was made up of women. And I'd like for you all to address whether or not you think that that makes a difference.
Okay. And there's a question in the back there. That'll be our last one.
Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, Paul Miller, Lutheran World Relief. A question for the panel about the possible role of the diaspora of the three Central American countries here in the United States. I know the consulates of these countries are certainly apprised and working on the consequences of this crisis, as are all the families, and we know about the remittances. But is there a specific role on this question for some of these populations who are interested and willing to help?
Good, thank you. All right. Anyone who want to take on Nicaragua? Ambassador Campbell here can fill us in.
Sin centrarme específicamente en Nicaragua, definitivamente la presencia de mujeres en la policía, en la fiscalía, en la judicatura hace una diferencia. Pero cuerpo de mujer no garantiza perspectiva de género. Entonces, no es un paso, pero tiene que ser complementado con formación, con recursos, con apoyo en seguridad, con equipos multidisciplinarios, etcétera, etcétera.
Great. Any other?
I was just going to say, I don't know the specific instance of Nicaragua, but I was just thinking about when we do try to make sure that there are many more women in police forces for some of the reasons that makes sense that you would know. I think the other thing we have to keep in mind is what does that actually look like, and is it meaningful, right? And so are you brought in, and do you have the same professional opportunities? Is there an advancement track and all of that? And so I think, sometimes it can be a little, with all of these things, it can be sometimes a little bit of a checking of the box. And I think the real trick is it participation and engagement, and are you there on an equal basis with men, and do you have a way to work that way, including the way promotions and that sort of thing is done. And so just a note about that in general in terms of how to make sure it's done in a way that is effective all the way around.
Is there any comments on the role of the diaspora?
That is a good question, yeah.
So Paul, I'm wondering, do you have some thoughts actually that would be good to No, I mean that you'd like to sort of make sure get brought out in that regard? It's a great question.
I'm not in a position to add too much, except to say that not only is this crisis, of course, affecting families here that come from those countries, American citizens and residents, but that I know that there are a number of diaspora investment associations. So this issue of linking women's livelihood protection, particularly for those who are displaced, and I know a number of Central American countries have wanted to do more, particularly for those who are deported or come back. And so, it is something which I'm interested in. I don't have any more background, but I wonder whether either in particular associations or in the work of some of your groups, you've come across some of these citizen activists who are connecting to their home countries and beyond sending remittances to family members, but in terms of investment and support for people in those situations.
It's a good thing.
I would just say that like with many diasporas, the community is extremely important. And I guess, especially right now, in this time of uncertainty, there are a lot of fearful communities. And I hope that all of us, are keenly aware of that and remember, to demonstrate that we are all in this together. I also know that many of our organizations do work with communities here in the United States that are diaspora communities and who include people who've come here under many different circumstances and in many cases fled very difficult circumstances. And so in those cases especially, again, not just in the case of Central America, but from many countries from many regions of the world, we're talking about, in the case of refugees especially, asylum seekers, people who frequently do need services and who are dealing with trauma and also dealing with settlement. So knowing that we are always richer when we learn from the experience of others, there is a role for the community in the work that we do, and I think that that again, all of us right now have an opportunity to really demonstrate that we have a role to play, whether it's here in the United States or paying attention to what's happening in countries where, violence is quite an issue. Thank you.
I'm tempted to call on Walter Tejada to talk to us about this issue, but it seems like such a valuable issue that maybe we should think about organizing another
Might be a whole
panel
other-
discussion.
yeah.
Walter Tejada is, of course, a Salvadoran American who served here in this country, but also works a lot with the Salvadoran community abroad, and there are other folks. So I don't want to go on that. Ambassador Ruiz asked to say a word, so if you don't mind, and then we'll give people a last chance to say the last things.
Well, good afternoon. This is a question for Claudia. As you know, Claudia, you have been an inspiration to many women in Guatemala, and I would say in Central America. And education is so important that I was wondering if you could envision promoting new projects to have law students and young judges of Guatemala come to study in this country. As you're obviously aware, and I'm not sure the public is, the number of women judges in Guatemala is very, very high. And in the university, the number of law students who are women are also very high. But unless they see there's a way forward, unless they see that there are more opportunities out there, I'm afraid they will be disappointed. I'm afraid they will not have the opportunities they wanted to have. So maybe through education, good example is fine, but we also need more education, more study opportunities for these women. Is there a way we can, I think we would all be willing to help and support you, that we can find scholarships and opportunities for young women, young judges who want to pursue their further studies?
Claudia, do you want to say anything about that, and then we'll wrap up?
Sí, la educación, el acceso a la educación es una de las claves para reducir la exclusión y la inequidad. Yo misma fui beneficiada con una beca de la cooperación española que me permitió estudiar afuera, doctorarme. Y no es solo el acceso a la educación, sino la posibilidad de entender cómo hay sociedades que funcionan de otra manera, de una manera más democrática, más horizontal, menos sexista, etcétera, etcétera. Así que creo que sí, es todo un tema, todo un desafío. Becas de educación superior, pero becas de primaria y de secundaria en Guatemala para niñas y para niñas indígenas creo que es algo fundamental.
Carelia, any last thoughts you want to share? You don't have to, but I'm just giving you the option.
No, just thinking about the participation of women in the region. We think that the most important thing is to assure the equal opportunity to participation of the people in the institutions, and there is something that we are ensured in our projects, and we are ensured that we have a gender approach in every project that the bank is approving right now. So we think that is a very important thing.
Good. Alex or Joan?
Yeah, I think when I was coming over here today, I was thinking about this phrase that came out of the World Humanitarian Summit, our common humanity. And I think for me, that's what I'm left with, that when we in the US think about this and do this work, we need to be motivated by and guided by our common humanity. Whether it's in the work we do bilaterally, whether it's in the support we're trying to provide to neighboring countries to strengthen their asylum systems, but most importantly, in how we behave in terms of our own policy and practice at our own border. And I think US leadership on this is so vital, both for the reality and the signal it sends in the region, but also globally too when you look at these dynamics across the board. So that's my final.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Just a couple of quick announcements. We generally will post this event on our webpage. It probably won't happen now until tomorrow morning, but please feel free to look at it again and spread it around and share it on the social media. And then secondly, again, this is the inaugural event of a series of events. So on February 3rd, we have an event on violence and the unexpected increase in homicides in Mexico, in some of the key cities in Mexico, and then what is being done, how to prevent and reduce violence and homicides in Mexico. That's February the 3rd. And on February the 7th, I believe, you'll have to look for it. Anyway, we're working with the World Bank on another big World Bank study on violence in Latin America and what's driving it, understanding the economic dimensions of violence that Carelia discussed just a minute ago, and also what can be done to prevent it. So we were going to continue on this cycle of topics to drill down and understand the violence that's affecting our region and how we can respond. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.